I never imagined that the person who once saved me from being a frightened, stuttering little girl would one day become the reason I lost my entire family. If you had told me 5 years ago that my own sister-in-law would accuse me of sexual assault and that my parents would believe her without hesitation, I would have laughed in disbelief. Back then, my life felt stable, predictable, safe. Now I'm 32 years old, sitting in a quiet house in Colorado, writing this because the truth finally surfaced, and it destroyed everything in its path. The accusation didn't just take my reputation, it took my brother, it took my parents, it took the version of my family I thought was unbreakable. What still haunts me is how fast it all happened. One moment I was a daughter, a sister, a trusted member of the family. The next, I was a criminal in their eyes, without evidence, without a conversation, without a chance to defend myself. And the worst part? They didn't even hesitate. 5 years passed in silence. No apologies, no questions, no doubt. I rebuilt my life with the man who stood by me when no one else did. I learned how to breathe again without waiting for the next accusation, the next explosion. I thought the story was over. I was wrong. Because last week, the truth came out in the most twisted way possible. The woman who accused me of assault, who painted herself as a victim and destroyed my relationship with my family, was exposed for having an affair with her own father's close friend. A married man, old enough to be her uncle, someone my parents trusted, and suddenly, everyone wanted to talk. The same parents who once told me I must have done something to deserve such a serious accusation were now crying on the phone. The same brother who assaulted me without listening was suddenly misled. The same family that cut me off wanted forgiveness. But by then, something inside me had already died. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how quickly love turns into violence when lies feel more convenient than truth, and how sometimes losing your family is the only way to finally save yourself. Before my name became something whispered behind closed doors, before my parents looked at me like I was a stranger they didn't recognize, I was just a girl growing up in a middle-class home in Ohio, quiet, observant, and deeply attached to my older brother. My brother, Henry, was 3 years older than me. To the outside world, he was everything I wasn't supposed to be. Confident, athletic, charismatic. Teachers adored him. Coaches fought over him. My parents never hid their pride when they talked about him. Family gatherings revolved around his achievements, his future, his potential. And yet, somehow, none of that ever made me resent him. Because when I was little, I had a stutter. It wasn't the kind people laugh off politely. It was the kind that made other kids impatient. The kind that turned simple introductions into moments of humiliation. By third grade, I had learned to dread reading aloud. By fourth, I had learned how to stay invisible. Henry never let that happen. When kids mocked me on the playground, he stepped in without being asked. When I came home in tears because I couldn't finish a sentence in class, he sat with me at the kitchen table every single afternoon, reading out loud together. Slowly, patiently, repeating words until my voice stopped shaking. "Take your time," he used to say, smiling like there was nowhere else he'd rather be. By high school, my stutter was gone. People praised speech therapists, doctors, programs. But I knew the truth. My brother gave me my voice. That bond followed us into adulthood. After college, we even ended up working for the same tech company, different departments, same building. We had lunch together almost every day. We went to the gym 3 times a week. We joked about how our lives had accidentally synced up. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without having to fight for space. Around that time, I met Daniel, the man who would later become my husband. He was steady in a way my family wasn't. Thoughtful, observant. When I told him about my childhood, he listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. He just said, "You deserve better." Henry met Bianca 3 years ago at a company party. She worked in HR at a competing firm, and from the beginning, something about her unsettled me. She was charming, but not warm. Flirtatious, but calculated. The kind of woman who enjoyed being watched. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it, but the comments, the looks, the way she created tension without ever technically crossing a line. Daniel noticed too. Still, Henry was in love, and because he had always protected me, I convinced myself it wasn't my place to question his happiness. That was my first mistake, because the woman who would later destroy my family didn't appear overnight. She walked in smiling, laughing, and everyone, including me, let her stay. Looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. They just didn't feel dangerous at the time, only uncomfortable in a way that was easy to dismiss if you wanted peace more than truth. Bianca had a way of commanding attention without raising her voice. At office gatherings, she laughed a little too loudly, touched people's arms when she spoke, held eye contact just a beat longer than necessary. It wasn't inappropriate enough to call out publicly, but it lingered, like a perfume that stayed in the room after she left. At their first Christmas party together, Henry stepped away to grab drinks. Bianca stayed behind, dancing with his coworkers, her hands resting on shoulders that weren't hers to touch. When I leaned over and quietly suggested maybe she should slow down, Henry brushed it off. "She's just being friendly," he said. "You're reading too much into it." Daniel caught my eye from across the room. He didn't say anything, but his expression told me he felt the same knot in his stomach that I did. The engagement party should have reassured me. Instead, it made everything worse. Bianca made suggestive comments about the waitstaff right in front of Henry, like she wanted to test how far she could push without consequences. Daniel overheard her telling her friends that one of the servers had a great body and that she wouldn't mind getting his number. When I confronted her privately, she laughed. "You're so serious," she said, waving her hand. "I joke around. That's just who I am," I told Henry, again. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me. He just didn't listen. 6 months after their wedding, Bianca started showing up at my house unannounced, always when Daniel wasn't home. The excuses were harmless on the surface. Returning a book, needing to use the bathroom, being in the neighborhood. But once she was inside, she lingered. She sat too close on the couch, asked questions that felt oddly personal, touched my arm when she laughed. When I shifted away, she followed, like she was daring me to say something. The air felt wrong, heavy. I told Daniel everything. We agreed on one rule. I would never be alone with her again. After that, I always had an excuse ready. A work call, a sudden errand, somewhere else I needed to be. Bianca noticed. I could see it in her eyes, the irritation, the loss of control. At Daniel's suggestion, we installed a doorbell camera, not because we expected danger, just because something felt off. I didn't know then that those quiet instincts, those moments of unease I kept pushing down, were my body trying to protect me. I only knew that the woman my brother married made my home feel unsafe. And that fear, once planted, doesn't stay small for long. The night everything collapsed didn't start with violence. It started with crying. It was just after 7:00 p.m. when the doorbell rang. I remember the time because I had just taken dinner out of the oven, the smell of roasted vegetables filling the kitchen. Daniel was still at work. I was alone, something I rarely was anymore. When I checked the camera on my phone and saw Bianca standing there, mascara streaked down her cheeks, my stomach tightened. She looked small, broken, harmless. "I just had a huge fight with Henry," she said when I opened the door, her voice shaking. "I don't know where else to go." Every instinct in my body told me no. Every lesson I'd learned over the past months whispered that this was a mistake. But she was my sister-in-law, and she was crying. I told myself I would let her wait inside, nothing more, while I called my brother. She sat on the couch, dabbing at her eyes, talking nonstop about how lonely she felt in her marriage, how Henry worked too much, how she felt invisible. I stayed standing across the room, my phone in my hand, already dialing his number. That's when she reached out and touched my arm. It was light, almost accidental. I stepped back. She followed, sitting on the armrest of the chair instead, her hand brushing my shoulder as she spoke. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My skin crawled. "Please," I said firmly. "Just wait. Henry's on his way." When I moved to the kitchen, she followed again. This time I didn't hesitate. "Stop," I said. "This isn't appropriate." She froze for half a second, just long enough for something cold to flicker across her face. Then, 30 minutes later, Henry walked through the door, and Bianca transformed. The tears vanished. Her posture straightened. She smiled, bright and cheerful, like she hadn't been sobbing minutes earlier, like nothing had happened. Henry wrapped an arm around her, confused but relieved. I stood there in silence, my hands clenched at my sides, feeling like I had just survived something I couldn't explain. A few days later, I told my brother everything. Not angrily, not dramatically, calmly, carefully. He didn't explode, but he didn't believe me either. Soon after, Bianca started telling people at their church group that I was the one making her uncomfortable, that I had been flirting, that I had crossed boundaries. I confronted her in front of Henry. She cried. She shook. She said she was scared. And just like that, the ground shifted. Last week, it all detonated. Bianca told Henry that the night she came over crying, I had tried to sexually assault her. She said I forced myself on her, tried to kiss her, that she escaped only because she heard his car pulling into the driveway. None of it was true. I had a doorbell camera. It recorded everything, but I hadn't saved the footage. Why would I? Nothing had happened. At 6 a.m., Henry showed up at my house. I barely had time to open the door before his fist connected with my face. I stumbled backward, shocked, tasting blood. He kept hitting me, screaming words I couldn't even process. I defended myself instinctively. In the struggle, his shoulder dislocated. When my parents arrived, called by Daniel after he rushed home, they didn't ask what happened. My mother looked at me and said, "What did you do to make her say something like that?" My father said he always knew my closeness with Henry was fake. That was the moment I understood something irreversible had broken, because no matter what I said next, they had already chosen. After that morning, time stopped behaving the way it used to. The hours blurred together, stretched thin by shock and disbelief. My cheek throbbed where Henry's fist had landed. My jaw ached when I tried to speak. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow pressure in my chest, the feeling that something essential had been ripped out of me without warning. Daniel sat beside me on the couch, his hand wrapped around mine so tightly it almost hurt. He kept asking if I wanted to go to the hospital, to the police, to anyone. I couldn't answer. Every time I opened my mouth, all I could hear was my mother's voice. What did you do to make her say something like that? I replayed the night again and again in my head, searching for some detail I had missed. Some moment where I could have spoken more firmly. Shut the door sooner. Trusted my instincts instead of my sense of obligation. Was I too polite? Too quiet? Too willing to believe that being family meant being safe? Part of me still couldn't grasp that Bianca had looked my brother in the eye and lied so completely. Another part, the one I'd ignored for months, felt sick with recognition. Of course she had done this. Of course control slipping from her hands had turned into retaliation. When my parents finally spoke to me again later that day, it wasn't to ask if I was okay. It was to tell me how disappointed they were, how ashamed, how serious accusations like this didn't come from nowhere. My father said I had always lived in Henry's shadow and that jealousy made people do strange things. My mother suggested therapy, for me, so I could understand my behavior. I remember sitting there, my hands folded in my lap, realizing they weren't talking to me. They were talking over me. Daniel tried to intervene, calmly, respectfully. He reminded them about the camera, the timeline, the lack of evidence. My mother didn't even look at him. "You don't really know her," she said, meaning Bianca. "We do." That night, Daniel and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I had recently received a job offer in Colorado. Better pay, a fresh start, a chance to leave everything behind. When we told my parents we were moving, they called me a coward. Said I was running instead of taking responsibility. Said I was tearing the family apart. Henry sent a single message. "If you ever contact us again, I'll finish what I started." We left 2 weeks later. I spent months wondering if I should have saved the footage, if I should have tried harder to convince them, if silence had cost me my family. But slowly, through quiet mornings, therapy sessions, and Daniel's steady presence, I began to understand something painful and freeing at the same time. I didn't lose my family because I stayed quiet. I lost them because they chose to believe a lie that fit their narrative better than the truth ever could. Colorado was supposed to be an ending, a clean line drawn between the past and the life Daniel and I were trying to build. New routines, new neighbors, mornings that didn't begin with anxiety curling in my stomach. For a while, it worked. The silence from my family felt heavy, but peaceful, until the past found a way to follow me. 2 weeks after I shared my story anonymously online, a message appeared in my inbox late at night. The name stopped me cold. Mike, Henry's best friend since high school. We were never close, polite at holidays, distant at weddings, but his message was long, careful, and laced with guilt. He said he'd been meaning to reach out for months but didn't know how, that what Bianca accused me of had forced him to confront things he'd stayed silent about for far too long. We spoke on the phone the next day. His voice shook as he explained that Bianca had done the same thing to him, showing up unannounced when his wife was away, making suggestive comments, touching his arm, creating situations where they were alone. When he pulled back, she flipped the script, told Henry that Mike was the one pursuing her, that he was sending inappropriate texts. There were no texts. Mike showed Henry his phone. Bianca claimed he must have deleted them. The damage was done. A 20-year friendship collapsed overnight. Mike told me at least 3 other men in their circle had similar stories. None of them spoke up. Keeping the peace felt safer than challenging her version of reality. Then he sent me screenshots. A private Instagram account Bianca had created, filled with complaints about Henry, calling him controlling, boring, bragging about flirting with her gym trainer, mocking how easily she manipulated him. My hands trembled as I scrolled. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was proof. I thanked Mike and told him I didn't want to get involved. I had chosen peace. He understood, but warned me Bianca had been asking mutual friends for my new address. A day later, Daniel's sister called. Bianca had found her on Instagram, sent a long message warning her about me, claimed I had a history of making women uncomfortable, suggested Daniel should get tested for STDs because I probably cheated. That was the moment something inside me hardened. We hired a lawyer. Screenshots, doorbell footage, messages, timelines. The lawyer didn't hesitate. He said we had a strong case for harassment and defamation. A cease and desist letter was sent the next day. Within hours, my parents called. My mother sobbed about family loyalty. My father accused me of being cruel. They weren't calling to ask if I was okay. They were calling because the truth was getting louder, and they could no longer ignore it. For the first time since everything began, I didn't explain myself. I hung up. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after you stop defending yourself. Not relief, not peace. Just emptiness. After the cease and desist letter went out, I expected calm. Instead, my nights filled with restless sleep and vivid memories I couldn't shut off. I dreamed about my childhood bedroom, about Henry sitting across from me at the kitchen table, tapping the page and telling me to try again. I woke up with my heart racing, grief pressing down so hard it felt physical. Daniel tried to keep life normal. Morning coffee, evening walks, conversations about work and the future. But there was a heaviness between us. Not because of doubt, but because trauma doesn't disappear just because you move states. I felt guilty for dragging him into it. Guilty for the legal fees. Guilty for the constant vigilance. I caught myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault. One night I broke. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, my back against the bed, and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. Not for Bianca, not even for my parents. For my brother. For the boy who stood between me and bullies, for the man who believed a lie so easily that he nearly destroyed my life. I don't understand how he could hate me so fast, I whispered. Daniel sat beside me, his arm around my shoulders. He didn't hate you, he said quietly. He chose the version of reality that protected him from doubt. That was worse, because it meant the Henry that I loved hadn't vanished overnight. He had chosen not to see me. Days later, the call came. Mike again. This time his voice was urgent. Bianca's affair had been exposed. Not rumors, not suspicion. Evidence, messages, photos. A 6-month relationship with her father's longtime friend. A married man with adult children and grandchildren. Henry found the phone. What happened next made my stomach turn. Henry confronted Bianca. She tried to gaslight him, blamed loneliness, claimed emotional neglect. When she tried to leave, he lost control. The neighbor called the police. Bianca was hospitalized with broken ribs and a concussion. Henry was arrested. I sat frozen on the couch, phone still in my hand, unable to process the irony. The man who attacked me without proof had now nearly killed the woman who lied to him, with proof staring him in the face. That night, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick, because nothing about this felt like justice. It felt like tragedy, stacked on top of tragedy, until there was nothing left but ruins and the truth echoing too late. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the moment before everything finally collapsed. The truth didn't arrive gently. It came like a wrecking ball, loud, irreversible, and far too late to save anything it touched. Within days of Henry's arrest, the evidence spread through their social circle. Screenshots Bianca never thought anyone would see. Messages where she mocked her own husband, bragged about manipulation, laughed about how easy it was to control people who loved her. Richard's wife didn't stay quiet. She posted everything. Names, dates, hotels, conversations that left nothing open to interpretation. Bianca wasn't just exposed as unfaithful. She was exposed as deliberate, calculated, cruel. Women began coming forward. Stories echoed each other. Uncomfortable encounters. Flirtation turned accusation. Silence enforced by fear of drama. Even Bianca's own father cut contact when he discovered she'd been sleeping with his friend of 30 years. I watched it all from a distance, numb. Then my parents called, from a new number. This time they cried. My mother said she should have known something was wrong when Bianca kept changing her story. My father admitted they had favored Henry blindly, that they failed me. For a brief moment, my chest tightened with something dangerously close to hope. Then they asked for money, $25,000, for Henry's legal fees. The house they refinanced for his wedding was underwater. Their savings were gone. They said he was just protecting his wife, that any husband would have done the same. I didn't answer right away. I sat with the memories, the good ones, the ones that still hurt to touch. But Daniel was right beside me, steady, clear-eyed. "They're apologizing because they're desperate," he said gently, "not because they understand." That night I realized something profound. I could love my brother and still refuse to save him from the consequences of his choices. I wrote Henry a letter, told him I still cared, told him I hoped he would get help, but I wouldn't be paying for a better lawyer. Violence, toward me or anyone else, was a line I could never excuse. Mike later told me Henry cried reading it. My parents didn't accept my decision, but for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I chose myself. And in that choice, something shifted, because the power I had been begging others to give me had been mine all along. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, slow, relentless, and impossible to stop. Henry took the plea deal. 18 months in prison, mandatory anger management counseling. The judge didn't need much convincing. There were witnesses, medical records, and a paper trail of lies, too tangled to defend. Bianca tried to testify for a harsher sentence, but it backfired. Her credibility had already evaporated. Every lie she told sounded rehearsed. Every tear felt hollow. The courtroom didn't see a victim anymore. It saw a pattern. Outside those walls, Bianca's life collapsed, just as quickly. Screenshots of her messages spread faster than she could delete them. Women she once smiled at stepped forward with stories that mirrored my own. Her HR employer terminated her contract after multiple complaints surfaced about workplace harassment and manipulation. She tried to rebrand herself online, posting vague messages about surviving abuse, about being silenced. The comments filled with receipts, dates, quotes, evidence. Within a week, her accounts went dark. Last I heard, she moved to Nevada and started working as a waitress. No apology, no accountability, just another attempt to outrun the consequences she left behind. Richard's family cut him off completely. His wife filed for divorce. His adult children refused contact. The life he'd built crumbled under the weight of exposure. And my parents? They paid for Henry's lawyer by selling their SUV and taking out a second mortgage. They still call, still leave messages about family loyalty, about forgiveness, about how I'm punishing Henry for protecting his wife. They don't mention my bruises. They don't mention the threats. They don't mention how easily they believed I was capable of something monstrous. I stopped responding, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because peace isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg to be understood. Peace simply exists when you stop letting chaos have access to you. Daniel and I kept building our life quietly. New routines, weekly dinners with his family, laughter that didn't feel forced, support that didn't come with conditions. For the first time, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I was walking forward. And while the wreckage behind me was devastating, it no longer defined who I was allowed to become. The biggest lesson didn't come from the lies. It came from what happened after the truth. A few weeks after everything finally settled, Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight poured through the windows, warming the wooden floor. He reached across the table and took my hand, his smile soft but nervous. "I want us to have something that's ours," he said. That's how I found out I was pregnant. 3 months along. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not from fear, but from the weight of it. This tiny life felt like proof that something good could grow even after everything I'd lost. That love didn't disappear just because blood ties failed. It also clarified everything. I couldn't risk exposing my child to violence, to manipulation disguised as family loyalty, to people who chose denial over accountability. Going no contact wasn't punishment, it was protection. My parents still reach out sometimes. Emotional messages, guilt-laced apologies, invitations to visit Henry in prison. I'm not ready. I don't know if I ever will be. Because the brother I knew, the one who helped me find my voice, died the moment he chose violence over trust. And I've learned that grief doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means letting go. Daniel's family became my anchor. Weekly dinners, quiet support, no ultimatums, no conditions, just love. His father even offered to help with legal fees when things were uncertain. We declined, but the offer itself healed something I didn't realize was broken. This is what real family feels like. Not perfection, not blood, but safety. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take from this, it's this. You are not obligated to endure harm just because someone shares your last name. Love without accountability isn't love, it's control. Walking away doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally chose yourself, and that choice saved my life.